going back, I have to say, it's I don't want to sound, romantic or cheesy, but I have to say that my passion for consciousness started very early on, and I can, trace it back to really in my infancy. I was fascinated, literally obsessed by falling asleep and the mystery of falling asleep, not existing.
Following is my conversation with Marcello Massimini. Marcello is a world-renowned neurophysiologist for the past several decades working on the clinical aspects of disorders of consciousness. He and his team have invented this algorithm, PCI, and a method to reach into the minds, the conscious states of minimally conscious people in different types of comatose vegetative states. It is fascinating, just the research and its implications. Marcello takes an interdisciplinary approach to solve these problems in a very creative, innovative fashion. There are 1 million or so patients every year who get, unfortunately, one or other kind of the disorders of consciousness. This is a fascinating chat. We talk about integrated information theory, its phi score and intrinsic existence, and how it all compares to the PCI method. Marcello talks about his collaboration with different groups worldwide, and all the collaborations both with academia as well as with the industry. I found this conversation very encouraging for the mankind in terms of figuring out solutions to such fundamental problems. Marcello is a wonderful scientist. He has such humble way of explaining these complex concepts. I hope you're going to enjoy this conversation as well. And now, without any further ado, here is my conversation with no other than Marcello Massimini. All righty, so we hit the record button. Marcello, sir, how are you?
Good, Amjad. How are you?
Good, good. Hey, listen, we'll start with what the little glimpses that you showed me on Friday when we spoke for a little bit. You were in a lab, your lab, getting ready for your experiment. So maybe we'll start there. That what was all that set up, what it is that you guys were experimenting. Certainly, Marcello, there's a lot of interest in perturbation complexity index and its effectiveness to measure that minimal consciousness state. So looking forward to this chat. But also congratulations on your HPP award. So the innovation award that you and your team got. So exciting. So tell us a little bit about your lab and that experiment where you had all that sort of, equipment on you and you guys were getting ready to do some serious testing.
We are doing some testing of a new prototype. The machine we are testing, it's an evolution of this combination of machines, actually, we've been using over the last 20 years. And as you could see, I was wearing a cap with many electrodes, but also on top of my head, there was a bulky sort of stimulator, like a plastic thing with many tubes. And then maybe you spotted behind my brain on a screen. A 3D reconstruction of my brain was there, and then some waves probably on another screen. So What that is, I mean, if I have to describe it in a couple of words, it's a radar. And it's a radar that we are currently used for detecting consciousness in challenging conditions. And as a radar, it works by pinging directly the cortex with a magnetic impulse, and then by reading out the return echo from the brain. And the echo we read out, it's an electrical echo. And then we measure the complexity of this signal. So that was I was testing that. And we are testing, you know, optimizations of this whole thing in view of larger distribution of these techniques in hospital and everything. So we're trying to make, you know, for now, this radar it's a radar for experts. It's, you know, the first radar you see, you know, you have to point it, you have to understand a lot of things, but we are working towards something that is more plug and play, easy to use, and standardized. So that is what I was doing on Friday, and it worked well, I can tell you. I wish you could have, you know, witnessed everything on the screen, and it's interesting.
No, so true. So tell us, Marcello, a little bit more about, in this practical sense, what is consciousness and what are the disorders of consciousness that unfortunately a large number of people, statistically speaking, suffer. So let's kind of set the stage for your view as a scientist, as a clinician, of how you think about consciousness and what are these different disorders of consciousness.
Yes. So there is a spectrum of disorders of consciousness, but I think the problem is quite, you know, easy to explain. So let me say, first of all, you know, patients in a condition that we can classify as disorder of consciousness, the prevalence is about 1 million per year worldwide. So it's, you know, it's not a niche. And the problem with disorders of consciousness is a problem of detection. So what is a disorder of consciousness? First of all, it's something that normally follows coma. So the story is you have traumatic brain injury, you have a vascular brain injury, like a vessel is, you know, getting clogged, and then you have damage to large part of the brain, or you have bleeding. You can even have an intoxication or a cardiac arrest, and then no oxygen for the brain for a critical amount of time. So in all these cases, what happens often is that the patient falls into a coma. Coma is a state similar to sleep, with the difference, so the patient is eyes closed, just like sleeping, completely unresponsive, and you know, the difference with sleep, you cannot wake up a subject in coma. Why you cannot do that is because at the time of coma, there is some degree of impairment of this central structure in the brain. It's an ancient structure, the brainstem, where you have basically a master switch that is turning your wakefulness on and off. So subjects in a coma, they are in this irreversible, not irreversible, but they cannot be awakened, and they look like they're sleeping. Coma is a short-lasting disorder.
Hey, Marcello, just real quick, yeah. This switch that you mentioned in the brain stem, this older structure in human brain, what is the name of that switch?
So they're called activating systems. It's a bunch of neuronal populations with different names, employing different neurotransmitters, but they all do the same. I mean, if you want names, you know, one name is the reticular activating system. That is a cholinergic group of neurons. Then there are noradrenergic neurons. It's like a cocktail. which are located in the locus coeruleus. Then there are glutamatergic neurons spread all over the brainstem, and other, elements of this cocktail. What these neurotransmitters are doing is that they are basically sprayed all over the cortex and the thalamus, which is a deeper structure that is in tight connection with the cortex. And these neurotransmitters are doing something very simple, if you want. They are keeping neurons at the right level of polarization. That is, neurons are kept in a state that are just below threshold for firing, ready to fire in a very stable manner. And this is done, it's very interesting, by closing tiny channels on the neuronal membranes. These are called potassium channels. So all these neurotransmitters, all this cocktail, when these neurons in the brainstem are firing, all these neurotransmitters are released at the level of cortical neurons, and then they close potassium channels. Potassium is a positive charge. It's a positive ion, which would flow out of the neuron if these channels are not closed. So by closing these channels, you are keeping neurons depolarized, more positive, let's say.
Yeah.
If a neuron is at that level, it can fire, and there is this sort of readiness to react and interact. And that's why we are awake, because these systems are firing all the time when we are awake. When we fall asleep, naturally, they stop firing. And after a few seconds, neurons are becoming a little bit unstable, they start hyperpolarizing, and gradually they go into the deep stages of sleep where consciousness is lost in a reversible manner. You can be awakened. In coma, these neurons in the brainstem, they're not stopping their firing rate because they are controlled by homeostatic circadian factors, but because they are injured. At that point, you fall into a deep sleep, but there's no way you can turn the switch back as long as these neurons are suffering because of lack of oxygen, because they are compressed by increases. Because oftentimes when you have a brain injury, what happens is that you have bleeding and edema. There is inflammation in the brain, and the brain swells. But the skull, it's a rigid structure, and this swelling is discharged in terms of pressure at the bottom of the brain, pushing and compressing these brainstem neurons. And that's why oftentimes they suffer and they turn off the switch. That is coma. But coma is a short-lasting thing. It's, it lasts for a week, couple of weeks, and then, there is always an evolution or an involution after coma. Either you go into, unfortunately, brain death. It's also an outcome after coma. Brain death means that everything dies, and the compression and the swelling is such that everything dies in irreversible manners. Or these neurons in the brainstem, they recover. When they recover, normally what happens, and it's a classic, the patient opens his eyes. His eyes are open now. And the subject, by a neurologist or behavioral point of view, is awake. You can say the subject is awake. The eyes are considered as, a good indicator of wakefulness. But, best case scenario, subject opens his eyes and is able to interact and, show that he is conscious. No problem. That's not a disorder of consciousness. There is some cognitive impairment. Still, it's a neurological patient, more or less severe, but it's not a disorder of consciousness. Other times, patients, they open their eyes, so they are technically awake, but they only show automatic reflexive behavior, okay? And no response to command, no purposeful motor behavior. You can probe the patient, ask questions, pinch him, and they don't show coordinated, reproducible reactions. So that is unresponsive wakefulness. And now the unresponsive wakefulness syndrome is the new name for the vegetative state.
Mm.
There is a state of wakefulness, brainstem is working, the switch is on, something is wrong at the upper stage of the cortex, or say the thalamocortical system, and the patient is not there, or, and that's the problem, you know, it seems is not there if you look at behavior.
Yeah.
And now this is the problem. The problem is really distinguishing between a patient who is there, but just unresponsive, unable to react for some reason, or a patient that is really unconscious, like anesthetized, sleeping, you know, in a state that is similar to the state where we are fully anesthetized and we deny our existence. So this is the discrimination that becomes very difficult, and there is a gray area there that is very difficult to explore through behavior. So I give you, you know, to explain the problem, let me give you, you know, just another piece of information. The way we assess consciousness normally in these patients emerging from coma, meaning when they open their eyes, is to probe them through an input-output paradigm. We don't know, I mean, the problem is that with respect to consciousness, we are not so clear about the internal mechanism, so we treat the brain as a black box. And as neurologists, intensivists, or, you know, nurses, what we do is that we probe the brain with sensory inputs, verbal commands, and then we look at the motor output of the black box. And of course, if the motor output is there and the patient reacts in a reproducible and specific manner, no problem, he's conscious. But if he doesn't react, there are many possibilities. So either he's really unconscious, but also it could be conscious. It could be understanding our commands, but just fully paralyzed. This happens. Or it could be even disconnected on the input side, because he has lesions to sensory pathways, sensory cortices, and problems with information processing, sensory information processing. So he doesn't understand language. She doesn't get visual information. She cannot process auditory information or somatosensory information. So in these cases, you have an island that is a brain island that is large enough and active, and it has all the right features in place to sustain consciousness, but cannot be you know, seen by an external observer. So by the extrinsic perspective of input-output, you would never be able to see this island of complexity or island of consciousness inside the brain. So this is interesting. I mean, it's interesting. It's dramatic if you want, but we know this can happen. Because
it's terrifying, Marcello, to think about, you know, if somebody unfortunately is stuck in that condition, locked into that syndrome, and they are there, you know, using your terminology, somebody's home. I've been listening to your lecture all these years, so you probably would see some of your terminology I'm going to use as a layperson, as a software engineer, but it is just terrifying. And I want to just share with you a few things. So I'm sure that you heard about Adrian Owen, and I read his book also on first when I started getting to learn about this topic. But it is just from a normal person perspective, it is terrifying for somebody to be in that situation. And thank you for figuring out how to communicate or reach across when somebody is still home, but many of the input-output systems are shut down, and the traditional input-output stimuli response black box type approaches are no longer going to be working. I read your some of the documents that you sent me, and the fact that the PCI method bypasses all that input-output apparatus to detect what is going on. That is awesome, Marcello.
Well, thank you. Let me say, first of all, I really loved that book, The Gray Zone by Adrian Owen. And it's fantastic. I mean, it's terrifying, of course, but it's also a very, it really delivers the idea of, what intensive care medicine is producing. These are new situations, new kind of brains that are posing incredible clinical and ethical challenges. And I think that book really delivers the idea. And it shows, Owen showed once for all, that you can be indeed locked into your brain and not accessible. What Adrian does, and that is very clever, he bypasses motor outputs blockage. And the idea there is to deliver sensory inputs, motor commands, and read out directly brain activity that is upstream to motor output. So that could be preserved in many patients. And when you see that, when you see this specific activation to imagine play tennis, navigate into your house, I mean, it's there. The patient is there and there is no question. And what Adrian shows there, you can also implement basic forms of communication and also ask very important questions. That is, I think, a milestone in the field. It's not enough because it is true you can detect patients that are otherwise undetectable, but the sensitivity of this approach is quite low because it's demanding. And you need patients to be able to understand, to be concentrated on the task, to understand that the task is very relevant, to focus. And these patients, oftentimes, they have fluctuations of arousal, problems with attention, cognitive deficits, but also it implies that it requires that the patient is connected on the sensory side. And this is not a given, especially language-wise.
Yeah.
So the sensitivity of this technique is about 3–10%, meaning that you can detect, but you're also missing out many patients, and that's why we need to work together. And indeed,
that is right. That is right.
Often,
what I was thinking, Marcello, there was that PCI, which is a highly sensitive method, which captures many other situations. That for that to figure out those types of patients in that different variations of minimally conscious state with extremely high sensitivity and precision, and then some of these methods, the way Owen or others are working, they then can be downstream, step 2, step 3, after a detection is made that the patient is minimally conscious state and that sort of thing, then some of those methods can be more effective. So I think collaboration and combining these methods in the right order, to me as a software engineer, it looks like that is a good approach.
Thank you for saying this. I think this is precisely my view. They are complementary methods. Let's say PCI will never tell you anything about the content of consciousness. Is that patient happy? Is he in a dreamlike state, or is he in a state of intermediate? We don't know the content. And whereas the fMRI active paradigm, play tennis, you can sort of implement communication. You can ask the patient, and that's key, of course. So as you said, by the engineering perspective or detection, strategy perspective, we should start with. But this is what we do in medicine normally. We start with measures that are very sensitive, not really specific. Then we do another pass with a measure that is striking a good balance between sensitivity and specificity. And then we go for the interaction and for the communication with the patient. So we need to stratify and combine all these approaches. And I think PCI is in the middle, because we have other methods. I give you an example. If you do brain metabolism and you measure brain metabolism with a PET scan, you might see that there are patients with no brain, no cortical metabolism. Maybe because they suffer the post-anoxic insult, cardiac arrest, most of the neurons are dead. I mean, there's no real point in doing PCI there, and you should select those with residual metabolism. So this patient with residual metabolism, it is not a given that they're conscious. Under anesthesia, you can have metabolism. The brain is not zero, but you are unconscious. Sort of the same happens during sleep. So you need to screen them and employ a measure that is still sensitive, but also more specific. And I think PCI is there. So we have excellent sensitivity and good specificity, meaning that we don't have a lot of false positive. We never find an anesthetized subject with a high PCI.
Yeah.
Or sleeping people saying, I wasn't there, and then you find high PCI. And then if you pass that test, it means that you need to concentrate a lot of effort, like fMRI, brain-machine interface, cortical implants, if you want to go for communication. So I really believe into a strategy. And I just named, 3 things: metabolism, PCI, and fMRI active paradigm. You could use spontaneous EEG at some intermediate levels before PCI, because sometimes spontaneous EEG is good enough. But when it's, sort of unconclusive, then you need to go for something. So yeah, the idea is to stratify these measures in a meaningful hierarchical flow.
I have your book, so I have read it many times over, and you in the book, as well as in different articles that you have written, you mention your collaboration early on with Giulio Tononi and your trips to Wisconsin. And so can you maybe go back, Marcello, in time and tell us a little bit about how did your passion and journey into this whole area got started, and what kind of things you have done with that group in Wisconsin, Giulio, Larissa, Melanie. It's an amazing team. You have an amazing team. And in that process, I think, Marcello, it would be good to know about, for you to share with our audience, your team and, in Milan and all that good stuff. And so it would be awesome for you to share any perspective that you can. And I, by the way, it's my desk reference, so I refer to it a lot of times. So I can't tell you how many times I have written my notes in it. And, so it's a good book, Marcello. Thank you. Hopefully in the years ahead, you will write another one. So
thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you. Well, going back, I have to say, I don't want to sound, romantic or cheesy, but I have to say that my passion for consciousness started very early on. And I can, trace it back to really in my infancy. I was fascinated, literally obsessed by falling asleep and the mystery of falling asleep, not existing, sort of like dying. I think at that age, kids, they start, realizing that they can fade, that they can die, that people can die. And falling asleep was, a moment for me that was very interesting and mysterious, frightening, and at the same time, like it was a liberation, because then I was waking up in the morning and, I had this, I was, paying a lot of attention to this fact that you could be there and then completely disappear. Fascinated by sleep. And this led me, to, I want to be a urologist. I want to understand this and that. I did medical school. Then after medical school, I had a bit of a crisis because I didn't know what to do. And I was here in Italy, a little bit stuck. And I went, and I was lucky enough to meet a collaborator of Mircea Steriade. He was, I want to spend a few words about him. He was a Romanian neurologist who fled from Romania. At the time, there was the dictatorship.
Yeah.
Ceausescu, and then he established himself in Canada, and he, I think, is the greatest neurophysiologist, to me, one of the greatest neurophysiologists ever. He was the first one to describe what happens at the level of single cortical neurons when you fall asleep, when you become anesthetized. And basically, he discovered the cortical correlates of the electroencephalogram, that is the EEG, during sleep, wakefulness, and everything. And what he discovered is that as soon as you fall asleep, neurons, neurons are normally quite active in a tonic way, as I was saying before, because of activated system, that you ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta. And then when you fall asleep, every once in a while, they fall into a silent state. This was a fascinating discovery. This is the neuronal correlate of EEG waves that are typical of sleep, big, slow waves, because all neurons are becoming silent and then active, silent, active, and so on. So, bottom line, I went to work there. As a PhD, I asked him, look, I have my own PhD money. Can I come there? He said, yes, of course you can. So there, I was exposed to the mystery of changes in brain states by the perspective of neurons, single neurons, and overall activity at the same time. That was very interesting. So I came back to Italy after this beautiful, very also, intense period in Canada. And I wanted to study how information transmission is
And was
affected.
that, Marcello, in time?
This
How
was
long
2000, turn of the millennium. Yeah.
Okay.
Then I wanted to study how these silent periods, short rhythmic silent periods, are affecting information transmission, because I said, okay, well, maybe when you fall asleep, you become unaware, at least unaware of what's happening in the environment, because you have these interruptions, and stimuli are making it through the brain only every once in a while, and then you have these interruptions in the processing. And so I did my first study. I remember with a crazy, whatever I had here in Italy was a 4-channel EEG amplifier in a room, in a basement. And I did my first human recording, studying how sensory information is transmitted during periods of activity and periods of silence when you fall asleep. And there was a big difference there. So I said, oh, something gets really distorted by these silent periods and waves. And then at the same time, I was reading another beautiful book that is A Universe of Consciousness by Giulio Tononi and Gerard Edelman. This was a book published in '98, a couple of years before. And the book was actually, giving a very new message and new view on consciousness. And the idea is that what matters is the complexity of internal interactions, not so much the fact that you are processing stimuli from the outside, sensory stimuli, but really the exchange of information within the brain, or even the generation of information within the brain. Then I thought, oh, I should study not so much how the periphery, information from the periphery to the cortex is affected by this silent period, but rather how cortical information transmission is affected by silent periods. And thus I dropped an email to Giulio Tononi, whom I didn't know at the time, and he was based in San Diego at the time. And I wrote him an email, and I just said, I would like to do this and to study. I've read your book, your papers, and I think it's important to study this. I think there is a technique maybe to do so. And I have to say, to be honest with you, I also liked the fact that he was in San Diego, because after, after a long time in Canada, in Quebec, I was, also looking for some. And he was very quick in responding, and he said, sure, come. And I said, oh, that's great. Where are you based? What should I do? Come, I just moved to Wisconsin. And I said, oh, no, my God. Anyways, I flew to Wisconsin, and I mean, that was incredible because I wanted to do this study. And I knew that there was a new technique available that is combining transcranial magnetic stimulation with electroencephalography. This was not possible before because you have a lot of artifacts otherwise. But another fantastic scientist, bioengineer, Risto and Moniemi, based in Finland, he was at the Biomag in Finland. He showed that is possible. You can perturb the brain, one part of the cortex, and record a few milliseconds after what happens in other parts of the brain. That was beautiful. So I went to Giulio Stononi's house in Wisconsin. I pulled out a paper by Risto and Moniemi from my backpack, and he pulled out, and he said, look what I have. And he put out the same paper. It was really a niche paper.
Yeah.
You don't, it cannot be by chance.
That is universe. That is universe bringing the two of you together in that moment in time.
I said, yes, I had my problem with going into another cold place. Wisconsin was not necessarily my dream at the beginning. Then I learned to love it. But I said, you know what? This is too much. I mean, it cannot be by chance. You have to do that. And so I moved there. And there we started. It was sort of, it took time, but we got in touch with, we were very lucky. It was a stream of lucky strikes because we were a little bit frustrated with combining TMS with EEG, with the equipment we had. But then we got in touch with Nextim, a Finnish company who was producing the first research prototype for doing this kind of measurements. Henry Annula, which I still talk to now, is now the big shot in Nextim. At the time, he was in the one part of the R&D team in Nextim. He came to Wisconsin and said, okay, we discussed, we have this idea, can we strike a deal? Can we have the prototype? We got the prototype. That was a beautiful machine. And so we started collaborating with Nextim back then, 2002. And what happens is that 2 years later, we had a paper on Science with this new technique. So that was quick because we were lucky. We got the right equipment with the right question in mind. What happens to cortical communication when you fall asleep and all this. And this is, by the way, Giulio Tononi calling.
All right. Look at that. Look at the universe.
Yeah, he never calls, but just to say that.
We are, universe is sending him another signal. No, that is, I'm also a huge fan of Giulio. Well, it would be good perhaps for you to talk about your understanding of IIT, and certainly IIT integrated information theory. It has gone through a lot of development, progress, evolution all this time. And these concepts of integration and differentiation and causality would be good for you to, a lot of people in our audience, Marcello, they have good knowledge of physics and systems dynamics and computational biology, computational neuroscience. So it's a good company for them to hear from you, your perspective on anything that you want to share with your understanding of IIT.
Yeah, thank you.
And it will be a good time. Look, the universe wants us to talk about IIT. Giulio just called you. So let's talk about IIT and what all the implications are of IIT. It's a wonderful theory and a lot of people developing it and all that good stuff.
Yeah. As you know, it's also hotly debated and criticized.
It is hotly debated and criticized. As a student, I have learned the two schools of thought, IIT and the global neuronal workspace by Stainless Dehaene, Nikosh, those guys. So it looks like those are two prevalent sort of, currently in neuroscience, two contender theories or proposals, as David Chalmers would call them, IIT and global neuronal workspaces. I am drawn to, I have a lot of physics background. So because there is a lot of physics-like stuff in IIT, I get drawn to it. The other excitement that I, as an engineer, have toward IIT is it is substrate independent. It does not require that you got to be a living organism and a biological machine. The framework applies to any physical system that can meet that criteria. So anyways, but you're right that these are very sort of still early stages of it. Okay, let's hear from
Yes.
you, sir, on IIT.
Yeah. First, yeah, you're right. It's a theory where, while the global neuronal workspace, it's a neuronal theory. IIT is more about the physics of consciousness, I would say. And I agree with you. It's more in line with theories in physics. Although you can have predictions and measures emerging from IIT that you can apply to brains in very interesting ways. By an historical perspective, so I, as a practical guy, as somebody who's interested in measuring hands-on, I have to say that I find already very interesting the initial idea by Giulio and Gerard Edelman that I was mentioning before, the idea that there is a link between consciousness and complexity. Complexity defined in a very specific way, is coexistence of differentiation and integration, unity and diversity. This was an early concept. There were some measures, but IIT is clearly evolving from there. And I have to say that this idea in '98 sounded a little bit crazy and out of the main path, because at the time, there was a lot of emphasis on gamma activity.
Yeah.
There was a lot of emphasis on binding, basically coherence, among neurons. The fact that neurons are oscillating together, meaning they're sharing something, and thus this could be very important for consciousness and all this. And the idea of complexity, diversity, unity was a little bit, sounded weird. But today, I can tell you, and we wrote a review about that, but everybody would agree that complexity, precisely defined as the coexistence of differentiation, dynamic complexity, you can call it in many different ways, but it's differentiation and integration at the same time measured. It's empirically what works best. And you have about now 200 papers out on consciousness and complexity across many different conditions: anesthesia, coma, sleep, psilocybin, you name it, epilepsy, and it works. Everybody, 20 years later, everybody converges on that. They don't necessarily acknowledge that there was a paper saying consciousness and complexity 20 years ago, but this, and because maybe they came there through, their own trajectory. But the thing is, look, IIT might sound crazy now with some of the new predictions, the way it is formulated, but wait and see in 20 years, because the idea of consciousness and complexity sounded weird in '98, and now it's a mantra. Now it's fashionable to say consciousness and complexity. And so that's just to say, let's see. Regarding IIT in itself, as I said, I find there are a few things that I find very, very interesting. I'm not a theoretician. I'm not strong in mathematics, not enough strong at least. And but I can say a few things that I think are, very novel, and in the end, I'm convinced by that, logically speaking. So first of all, IIT starts from consciousness, takes consciousness very seriously, and as a basis for science. So it takes experience as the first material to work on. And I cannot disagree with that. I mean, everything, and you as a physicist, I think you also have this view, is that reality is sort of, well, it's there, but it's the way it is, it's more like a postulate, and we are trying to understand the reality out there.
Yeah. What
I can be sure of, and where I can really say something, is about my experience, no doubts about it. And I know it has certain general features, and roughly the theory starts from there. There were two axioms at the beginning, that is, consciousness is unitary, and because you cannot split it in two, and it's also differentiated, rich in information. Not because you can have, in a way, because you can have so many conscious experience and countless alternatives, but also because each conscious experience is specific and different from others because of all the features it combines. And then there are three more axioms now, and these axioms are needed, and they also derive from the observation of conscious experience. And now, it's interesting because you could say it's a theory in evolution. Yes, it is in evolution. It's axioms shouldn't, evolve. They are axioms. But wait a second. I mean, we need to really. Everything is happening in the space of a few years. And also, you need to put forward ideas, and then you have a discussion, you refine these discussions. But at some point, I mean, there is something really good about it. There is a structure to experience. Experience as features. And that's what we know. We can discuss the specifics of it, but there are features. And this is what we know best. And I know also that I'm conscious with some features. But when I'm called to infer on the level of consciousness of other people, say you, I do that by analogy only. You are nodding to me, you have eyes open, and you are reacting in a purposeful way, a very meaningful way to my, my things that can be, confused, but I see you are there just like me, so I infer that you are conscious. But then, as I said, when you go to patients who are not, then it becomes more and more and more difficult. Then you go to animals, computers, and all the rest. So we need ways to make an inference on the physical world, and it's not easy. Starting from you, and then patients, and where do I start from? So I start from the properties of the structure of experience as it is, and I look for the same properties in the physical world. So this is the idea. And I find this idea extremely humble.
Yes.
It sounds crazy, but it's humble in a way. And it's strong. It says consciousness exists, first of all, because, we can discuss about it. But if you don't do this, you end up being a consciousness denier. You pretend you're studying consciousness, but you are actually studying functions, some cognitive features that a cerebellum or a computer could do as well without being conscious at all. So if you don't start from consciousness, you end up denying consciousness. I could give you examples of that. But the thing is, this is the thing I like, besides the specific, the math and everything. Obviously there is something in evolution. But this key idea is very important. And this is the idea that is criticized. So this is where IIT is, where people shoot at IIT. And I think it's right. I mean, it's good to have this debate. It's very interesting. And I think it's also a merit of IIT. But this is a key thing. It takes consciousness for, seriously. And there is this zeroth axiom: consciousness exists.
I love that fact that IIT starts with consciousness. It is a very distinct theory. As you say, a lot of humility in it. It is a bottoms-up thing. It assumes consciousness exists. It starts with that. It pays a lot of attention to phenomenology and experience and say, okay, let's start with what an experience is made of. And the physicist and computer scientist in me, so I'm just a student of neuroscience, time permitting, I read that stuff, but I have a lot of training in computer science and physics. So from that perspective, I'm really drawn to it. But then also, Marcello, it is lately, people here in the US, I'm sure in other places too, are talking about how to bring artificial consciousness into artificial intelligence and make machines and software programs that not only can perform certain tasks in a skillful way, but they also have some consciousness-like properties. And here we use a term, fake it until you make it. So you start with mimicking consciousness. So theories like IIT, they give software engineers and computer scientists a framework, or even electrical engineers a framework to how to think about consciousness. And if you were to bring it into a machine and that has, or a software program that has a high phi score, how to do that. Now, suddenly, since there is a lot of physics there, so it just can't be just code. You got to have your physics working in a certain way for that complex pattern to emerge. It's my way of saying it is a fascinating sort of topic. One question, Marcello, that I'll ask you is, in your study and research, going back to, since you are so much into practical stuff, solving problems, you mentioned at the beginning that, hey, there are these switches, the activation systems, they spray stuff, the neurotransmitters, neuromodulators. You mentioned the word cocktail. What are those different types of neurotransmitters that these activating systems use in some fashion to wake us up? Can you please mention, what are those, different cocktails or different types of neurotransmitters?
Yeah, it's a cocktail that comes in different flavors depending on the mix, and it can change when you dream as opposed when you're awake, and different stages of sleep. But the ingredients are it's cholinergic neurons, so acetylcholine, noradrenergic neurons, so noradrenaline. Then we have glutamatergic neurons, histaminergic neurons, and and this is basically the cocktail, and they all do the same thing. As I said, they block these potassium channels, they close potassium channels, preventing neurons from going down. Now, this is a necessary condition for consciousness. You could replace these structures with a drug that closes potassium channels in the cortex. I think you could have consciousness without the brainstem, just by replacing and closing potassium channels in an orchestrated manner with optopharmacology or just pharmacological means.
Are there people working on that? Because that was going to be my next question, that if, a million or so people are, that people get injured and life is life, are there clever ways for us to, layman question from me, repair these, neuronal structures? Or to your point, if at the end of the day it is all this cocktail pharmacology, can we, somehow pharmacologically through a, some mechanism of delivering that stuff there, is there a other way to just bypass brainstem for consciousness and say, we can revive consciousness by just throwing the right cocktail in the right mix I know it's not an easy problem to solve, but do you see that as a possibility? And are there people or research groups working on it?
Yeah, the problem is that in the vegetative state or unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, the cocktail is working as far as we know. Eyes are open and the brainstem is back into, working order, but that's not enough. The problem is oftentimes with cortical-cortical communication, cortico-thalamocortical communication. So what we think is happening there, and this is a great question, and it's an active, area of research, and we are really, making discoveries here, is that when you have a lesion, brain injury, say traumatic brain injury, you lose neurons, no question. You have structural damage, that's irreversible. And but also you have areas that are nearby the lesion that are falling asleep, even when the cocktail is there. So within wakefulness, the lesion comes with, as a side effect, with local sleep here and there. And this local sleep happens because there is an imbalancement between excitation inhibition. When you have a structural damage, you have a decrease in the amount of excitatory pressure on the nearby tissue, and this tissue goes into a sort of downstate, hyperpolarized downstate every once in a while that is similar to sleep. So the problem is not downstairs in the brainstem. You can have the brainstem, you can be fully awake in terms of the cocktail, but then here and there you have local sleep. When the lesion is massive, it's not just a stroke or a focal injury, but it's multifocal injury, then most of the remaining brain, whatever it's there, even though it's structurally intact, but metabolically active, it goes into a sleep-like low complexity state. The question is this potentially reversible? We know you can wake up, from sleep in physiological condition. Can we recover stable activity in these areas that are oscillating between up and downs and are not very effective in exchanging information? That's the question. And we have demonstrated that this is the problem with the perilesional area or the rest of the brain. In vegetative state patients, actually, whatever is left is stuck in a low sleep-like, low complexity state. In stroke patient, there is like a donut of the brain that is in a sleep-like complexity. We can read out this state of low complexity very well with TMS EEG. We are still not able to revert this. And we need to understand the mechanisms first. So potassium channels are, something interesting, but also the balance between excitation inhibition and other options that we need to study in models, maybe also, simulations, computer simulations.
No, that is fascinating. One thing that I want to just ask you this question, and maybe it is a little bit of a rhetorical question. So you as a scientist, as an engineer, you look for different combination of variables and what do they do. So again, in my sort of, just as a student reading about this stuff, it looks like, Marcello, that in the neocortex, a lot of cortex can be taken out and people will still be awake and conscious. So, people sometimes suffer and there a big chunk of prefrontal cortex is taken out. Sometimes, the entire 1/2, of the cortex, left or right side, is removed and whatnot. And there are so many cases out there where it looks like a lot of chunks of cortex can be removed, and it results into, as you said, all kind of cognitive impairment, and now you cannot do this or you cannot do that. But it looks like still, whatever remaining, input output stuff is there, and whatever remaining cognitive functions are there, that person is still, conscious and is able to do stuff, suddenly, impaired in many functions. So it is interesting also to see that, a lot of stuff can go away from cortex, and it's still, you still, are able to, be in the wakeful state, and whatever the remaining functions are, you can perform them. So what does that tell you? And then there are sort of colleagues like, I don't know whether you heard of the name of this South African neuroscientist, Mark Soms, who take this position that it is all that the intrinsic, consciousness is a subcortical thing. And again, I'm not a neuroscientist, so I'm just sort of, reading back what I sort of study, and it's not that much into, cortex. He puts a lot of emphasis into subcortical structures, because he has some case studies that he shows in his lectures where some kids, they don't have
anencephalic
they don't have any
setting.
cortex at all. And at least from a behavior perspective, he shows this where one very adorable kid, and she, goes in and out of conscious states. She has no cortex, but she's showing she's happy, she's angry. When her parents put her little brother on her, she shows happy. Her face becomes happy. She starts laughing and giggling, but while she has no cortex. So anyways, I was just going to ask you, what does all of that tell you about this conscious mechanism? Meaning, what truly gives rise to it, or suddenly, and when certain things are not present, then it goes away. Anyways, rhetorical question, but any sort of reaction, comments to this?
Yeah, no, it's an important question. So as I said, we are sort of validating with experiments, the whole community, a relationship between consciousness and a specific form of complexity. Next question is the geography of this complexity. Where is it generated, and where consciousness is generated, and that's very interesting. And I think there are also interesting clues for the other question you were asking before, artificial intelligence, of course, because some architectures are good, others are not.
Yeah.
Although they might perform well, in terms of input output, not all architectures are good. So take not only the brainstem or other subcortical structures. The basal ganglia are incredibly skilled in doing things, but in terms of architecture, they're not very much integrated. They're all parallel loops with little interaction. So that's one example. But take the cerebellum, and I think the cerebellum is very interesting for this question. I'll come to the cortex, but let's take the cerebellum first. Very interesting in general, very interesting for artificial intelligence. So the cerebellum is extremely smart. So I think part of our intelligence relates to the cerebellum, and many of our skills are there, including intuition, problem solving. When things come for free and you have a solution, not only when you're skiing or driving your car or playing tennis, but the thing is, you can remove entirely the cerebellum from the skull, and I'm talking 80% of our neurons. You take them out, you trash them in the surgical, trash bin, and consciousnness is still vivid, still there.
And we are still conscious, yeah.
You might have cognitive, deficits, motor deficits, but you're there. Now, there are other parts of the brain that that you can treat the similar way, and consciousness is still there. As far as we know, I mean, nobody. So parts that are sometimes removed surgically, sometimes they're just destroyed, are the frontal poles of the brain. So the frontal lobe. There are so many reports of patients with massive bilateral frontal lesion of with large extent, and they're still conscious. They have deficits, they have cognitive deficits, the famous Phineas Gage from, the famous book by Damasio, but there are so many, with massive frontal lesions. And sometimes also there is from lobectomy, lobotomy that was performed back then in psychosurgery. This is an indication that those structures are not, I mean, they contribute to consciousness, to some dimension of consciousness, self-consciousness, planning, all this, but they're not needed to be there. You don't need them. And indeed, those are the areas that now we are discovering with specific, paradigm where subjects are, exposed to sensory stimuli, but they're not required to say, I've seen it. So they don't have to report to do any executive function. Now we see that those areas are not even activated when you see things or you perceive. So they might be, maybe with some, degree and difference, more similar to the cerebellum because of their architecture. We need to study that. We need to understand why that's the case. Maybe it's the connections are less tight, not so integrated, and we know in the back you have strong, patchy connections. There is a different architecture. This is all interesting, and it bears a lot of relevance if you ask the question how to build conscious machines. And so we know that, of course, there is the functionalistic approach, or the sort of like the Turing test approach. I mean, to the extent that this machine does something that is indistinguishable, and I cannot tell apart, then I'm, I have it. But of course, do we accept that? Even in the light of patients, we have these dissociations between behavior, input, outputs, function, and conscience. We have it in dreaming. We have it in patients. And we already have it in some, we have it in the cerebellum, high performance, high speed, no consciousness. We know that. So we have dissociations in both directions, consciousness with no function, function with no consciousness. We might have it in artificial systems, depending on the architecture we implement. So so first of all, I don't know much about, artificial intelligence. I was exposed enough through the Human Brain Project. I'm part of it. And part of the Human Brain Project is implementing neuro-inspired architectures into artificial systems. And then, thanks to the Canadian Institute of Advanced Research, I'm a fellow there, I was exposed to very interesting interactions with major players in the AI deep learning network business. And that's interesting because I was in this meeting in Toronto a few years ago with Anil Seth and other, expert, much more expert in the field. But I just told them, the story of the cerebellum. And if you look at the cerebellum with these massive hidden layers of neurons, there is these granule cells. There are 40 billion cells, which is really the hidden, it's like a hidden layer. There's an input, hidden layer, the output of the Purkinje cell. And then you have this learning signal based on error. The cerebellum looks like a deep learning network.
Yeah.
Very much so.
Yeah.
And it is fast, high performance, but no consciousness. Why is that? And as far as we know, as I was saying, you can remove it and nothing, doesn't change much.
One question, Marcello, there, these, you mentioned these switches, they kind of, it looks like they spray stuff and, or is that also in a play that these switches are not connected to cerebellum, or are they connected to cerebellum, those activation systems?
Yeah, no, but the cerebellum receives, there are not many state-dependent studies in the cerebellum. So the cerebellum, wakefulness, sleep, it's not easy to record from the cerebellum in general, and we don't have an EEG. It's also sort of difficult in animals, but what we know is that there is neuromodulation to the cerebellum. It receives incredible number of input outputs, visual, auditory, anything. It's strongly connected to the cortex. It's a very interesting structure. It has all the switches in place. What it lacks completely, almost completely, is integration because it is divided into these segregated microzones. But most important, it's purely feed-forward. If you look at the architecture of the cerebellum, the signal is coming in through these mossy fibers, is going to the granule cell, Purkinje cell, and then out. There is no recurrent excitatory activity within the cerebellum. So the system, technically speaking, in IIT terms, cannot make a difference to itself. It's just a bunch of layers in and out. There is no system in the cerebellum. The cerebellum is an aggregate of feed-forward circuits, and it doesn't exist intrinsically under the lens of IIT because of this lack of recurrent excitation, most of all. And it's also very much segregated. I think that's telling a lot about
it does.
the
Can you
cerebellum.
maybe, Marcello, stay with this point? You mentioned a really good point here that would be good for our audience to maybe comment a little bit more on this intrinsic existence, meaning that there are some physical structures, as you mentioned, that have that integration and differentiation, and they are arranged in a certain fashion where they give rise to this intrinsic existence, this experience phenomenology. Cerebellum lacks it. But can you just maybe talk about that again, that what it looks like, what are the prerequisites, co-requisites for this intrinsic existence?
Well, it's the idea that the system can make a difference to itself, and it's at the core of the IIT, and it's also the correlate basically of the zeroth axiom. You must have a system with some intrinsic power, and this requires reciprocal interactions, and it requires a specific architecture. And it's interesting because, you know, there is this unfolding argument. I don't know if you heard about this interesting topic, but the idea, which is also put forward by, I think, Giulio and Christoph Tononi, and then it was also criticism to IIT. But anyway, the interesting part is that you can build a system that is high performance, or it has, let's say, a given input-output relationship in two ways. So you can have the same input-output relationship in two different ways. So one way is through a system with a lot of elements, many layers, purely feed-forward, where all inputs are mapped into all possible outputs. This would be a massive system, you know, of course, in space, big numbers, and if you want, you know, if these are neurons, energy consuming, eager for energy, and it would have a given performance, input-output relationship. This would look like, by the way, the cerebellum or these deep learning networks. But then you can have the same input-output relationship using much smaller set of elements that are interconnected in complex recurrent ways, and you can have the same exact input-output. That can be demonstrated mathematically. So basically, the reversal is that you have a system with few elements, with high complexity and high integration information. You can unwrap it, unfold it into a, you know, systems of many layers and feed-forward connections. They do the same, and they would pass the same Turing test. They would be, but in one case, according to IIT, you have the structure, this coexistence of unity, diversity, composition, exclusion, and all the postulate of IIT that are typical of conscious experience. And thus, by inference, that system would have intrinsic existence, if you want. So it's really, but I think this is very interesting because it exemplifies that, you know, behavior, yes, it is important for survival. And, but, you could build artificial systems that are very good at surviving, but evolution selected systems that were much more economical in terms of space, energy, and the side effect is that they had to have this intrinsic, cause-effect powers and intrinsic complexity that it's a structure, a physical structure that, it's a good match for the phenomenology of consciousness. So the best guess is that you will find consciousness in those systems, the inference. And so there is also an evolutionary, side to that, under condition of constraint. If you're constrained in terms of as we are as biological systems, you need to develop that kind of architecture.
Yeah, no, this is fascinating that in order for us to experience something, no special ingredient is needed if that part of the system has these right physical and complexity properties, these recurrent complex connections, sparse connections, that any system that has that can have an intrinsic existence, which is equivalent to having experiences that where it feels something like to be that system. That to me is a fascinating idea, that it is not just biological organisms, that other systems that are similarly organized, and then they can experience, and certainly a topic for another time, Marcello.
Sure.
But how would we talk about, if since we, as people sometimes don't even give to fellow creatures who are alive, we don't give the phenomenological consciousness sort of, courtesy to them and say, no, there is nobody there, let's kill the animals, let's not be nice to them and whatnot. I hope that, first of all, through this, over time, we become kind to other fellow living creatures, because to me, it very clearly comes across they are experiencing something. They may have different contents of consciousness. Maybe their contents are not as rich as your and my contents, but to me, it is very clear that any living being that I see out there, it is, to me, it's clear as a human that they are experiencing something. They may not have great memories. They may not have great memories about it. They may not plan ahead or, and that sort of thing. Maybe they don't have awesome contents of consciousness. Maybe they do, but it looks like they are experiencing it.
Yes. So there is also this criticism to IIT, panpsychism. So it leads to panpsychism. But wait a second. IIT, and I mean, the discussion also we had, although it was very coarse about this, intrinsic existence or causal powers, it's both enlarging and restricting the scope of consciousness in the world around us. So it's enlarging it to, as you said, other beings with thalamocortical systems. Well, it's difficult to argue that they are not, to some extent, conscious. And then consciousness is graded, and it can be low. So basically, I don't think that when I'm fully anesthetized, my complexity or phi will never go to zero. It will be some maybe minimal number. And of course, in us, because of physical and biological constraint, consciousness goes down in steps. I'm awake, then I'm anesthetized, it's one step, intermediate anesthesia, I'm very confused, and then nothing. But that nothing is not zero phi. So you need to calibrate your measure, as we do also in patients, based on experience. Ideally, I should have I would like to have a smartwatch measuring phi, and every time I fall asleep, I have this track record, and I wake up, I have an alarm. Oh, I wasn't there. Let me see. Oh, it was, 32 2 trillion phi. Oh, and then when I am awake, it's a staggering number that is, so I think it's, it makes sense that it's graded, although we don't experience all degrees, but also, so it's also in other systems with smaller brains, and maybe it could be in physical systems that, we don't know. But also IIT would say clearly that no matter what a deep learning network does, it will never be conscious. Whatever a computer will do in the next 20 years, as long as the architecture is the von Neumann architecture, never be conscious. Whereas other theories would say strong, definite yes. Well, that's dangerous. They would deny maybe consciousness to some non-talking, non-frontal being, animals with a small frontal cortex wouldn't be conscious, but then, a deep learning network would be strongly and much more conscious. That is dangerous. And I think this is a danger that, you need to make choices and you have to have a good radar. I think IIT has a good radar. For instance, the global neuronal workspace is not, it's also at risk of attributing consciousness to things that are probably completely unconscious. So it really depends, it's a complicated matter, but I think we need to be, as I said, sort of, it's funny because IIT sounds, and I'm talking, I'm not a complete, IIT person, I'm a user, more like a user of IIT.
Yeah.
And I find it useful, and I find that these measures and this idea from phenomenology, they're useful when you try to measure stuff in brains. But I think it's it is perceived as some sort of hubris. It's like, it's, you want to explain everything. How can you? But it's in the end, I think it's quite humble. I mean, it's.
No, I'm with you.
Let me make an inference to the best explanations, what I can do.
A couple other quick questions, Marcello. One is just anesthesia related. What happens when we are under general anesthesia, which is different from sleep? That is not exactly your deep sleep or your REM sleep. It is a different sort of, disturbance where some harmony gets disturbed and whatnot. So tell me a little bit about you as a clinician, that how does anesthesia affect, take consciousness away, and good for us that that we don't then experience any pain or any of that, and surgeons are able to operate on our body and all that good stuff.
Regarding anesthesia, there are so many ways of getting knocked out by an anesthetic, and there are so many compounds. Some of them we don't even know how they work. It's so easy to kill consciousness. I was going to say complexity. It's easy because it's a very delicate balance. I mean, it is very resilient, and but there are many ways to destroy this complexity. And interestingly, they all converge in these slow waves and silent periods I was mentioning. These silent periods are the killers of complexity, because I forgot to mention that these silent periods are there because of potassium currents, and they're also called adaptation currents. It means that, imagine a circuit or a transistor. The neuron is receiving an input. When during wakefulness, this current are not there, and the neuron reacts to the input and give it to the next neuron, and then next neuron feeds back, and you have this buildup of interactions. During sleep or anesthesia, you have these currents that are very active, and the neurons are receiving an input. They try to become active, but these currents are activity dependent. The more the neurons try to become active, the more it shuts down. So you have to imagine a situation where the neurons are receiving inputs, shutting down, and then they resume activity in a stochastic manner. Put this in a circuit. It's a killer, when each node is behaving like this, receiving, shutting down, and then like a random generator. Then there's no way you can build causal information. So these silent periods are very important with respect to complexity and intrinsic causal powers and all this. And all situations of unconsciousness, except for when the brain is completely destroyed, they tend to converge in these slow waves and silent periods. You can get there in many ways, okay? You can have slow waves by when an anesthetic is inhibiting primarily the brainstem. So you can do that. You can mimic sleep, but a sleep that is not reversible as long as your anesthetic is there, binding to the brainstem, inhibiting the brainstem. You have slow waves, silent periods, no complexity. As long as you want, then you retrieve the anesthesia and subject recovers consciousness. And then you can have anesthetics that are acting primarily on the cortex, say by maybe increasing inhibition at the cortical level. You could do that. And in that case, neurons are receiving inputs that are shutting down because of inhibition, not so much because of adaptation current, but it's always a silent period breaking, the chain of interactions. Then you can have anesthetics that are actually putting you in a state of unresponsiveness and disconnectedness. So this is very interesting. So one way is to do surgery is to knock the subject unconscious. It doesn't exist. You do what you want, then he recovers and with amnesia, but he wasn't even there in the first place. Now there are different anesthetics. These are dissociative anesthetics. Classic example is ketamine. Ketamine is very interesting. At some dosage, ketamine is making you unresponsive, disconnected from the external world, so you don't suffer any pain when they cut you open. But you are still conscious, just somewhere else. You're hallucinating in a parallel world, and this world can become crazy, bidimensional. You can have, even a bad trip. But you're not having any experience of the surgery. You're not there at the moment, but you are really dreaming like crazy and hallucinating. And that's another model.
Marcello, when people come back from the ketamine induced anesthesia, are they able to remember and report back what they were dreaming about?
That's how we know. That's how we know that they were conscious. Yeah. So we base we take consciousness for serious. So an anesthesiologist or some neuroscientists would say unresponsive, thus unconscious. But if you take consciousness, seriously, you ask them, were you experiencing anything? Was there anything going through your mind? And if they tell you, not a confabulation upon awakening, but a long, crazy story, super vivid, but where hours, that's a movie. And we collected together with Melanie Boli and Stephen Loris in The Edge, ketamine dreams, and we were measuring complexity at the same time. Those dreams are incredibly long. It's a movie, a very interesting movie, sometimes a scary movie. That's why ketamine is not used so much because of that. But it's consciousness, very vivid, in a condition of full unresponsiveness and disconnection. It's like it puts you in a condition of, being a patient who's vegetative, behaviorally speaking, but present, intrinsically there. Well, complexity is high during ketamine anesthesia, in spite of complete unresponsiveness, which tells you that there is this dissociation, even when you measure between complexity and behavior, inputs and outputs. And that's why we trust the measure, also because it works in ketamine. We trust it when it says, well, high complexity in spite of unresponsiveness. So in this perspective, anesthesia is very interesting because of all these different ways, and including disconnected consciousness, which is a great lesson to all of us.
very last question, Marcello. So where is your own, sir, over the next few years, you and your teams, PCI teams, research, which direction your research is expanding? I heard in the this article that you sent me, read in it, that you guys are now going to collaborate with people in Wisconsin at Mass General Hospital, many other institutes around the world. So would love to hear from that. And then I think as part B of that question is that what are the big practical questions, not philosophical, but clinical, practical oriented questions where you would like to see more collaboration and more research groups working together in a harmony. So more collaboration, less competition to achieve a better outcome.
So I have two, I think, tasks that I have to focus on. One is to make this TMS EEG, PCI measurements easier for other people. So it's a technical task. It's also an effort of dissemination and site visits, and I think it's the most important thing at this point. I mean, I know, I mean, as a scientist, it's not so, well, to me, it's very exciting, also as a scientist, to see that this can help and the people is happy using it. It's my primary concern. Because if it's us doing it or a small group, it's interesting. But it's, I think it's part of our duties to disseminate. The other aspect is, so by the way, we also have in mind to build a tool, to do this at the bedside in a reliable manner, something that can be, taken up by an hospital and used in clinical practice. Then, and this is because I see how it works, and I think it's important. Then, as I said, the mechanism of loss and recovery complexity are very interesting to me as a physiologist, as a neurophysiologist. So that's where I would put my scientific research effort in the future. In terms of, collaboration, and I feel so lucky as a scientist because I've always been embedded in a network of people. So now I'm talking, but I am a channel, through which I think, 100 people equally important, distributed are, saying something. They would say it in a different way, but we all, it's teamwork. We have different visions, different ideas, but I think being, a scientist, but also somebody who performs measurements helps a lot in building a community. And I also have to say, there is this strong, as you said, competition. I think it's a healthy competition between the theories. Sometimes it's really, a little bit too strong. It could be more relaxed. But anyways, but when it comes to people doing measurements and people, even, if let's say I have good collaborations and I could, with people, that are inspired by the global work spirit, because the moment you make a measurement, you want something that it's useful. And, we discuss and we have the same goal in the end. And, the theory is, it's important to the extent that it gives you ideas for better measurements. So I feel very lucky because, and actually there is this convergence in this empirical field on complexity that is really, it's a great community. So I think this is happening already, and I've been involved in so many research programs that are really a collaboration. Take Human Brain Project. That's incredible. It's fantastic. And then at the same time, the collaboration with Giulio Tononi, Christoph Koch, people in Harvard. I think it's, I like this word, and I don't have a dream in this sense because I don't want to be cheesy, but I have to say I'm so happy with the way this world is working right now. Of course, I have complaints. So, for example, I have a dream that all this push for science is becoming like a job. You know, in a way, it's okay, but I don't think it's okay that young postdocs or PhD students are pushed to publish sexy studies because you just can't. If you want to become a serious researcher, you have to be patient. And sometimes, you know, my own experience was that maybe I'm a loser, but at the end, you know, I spent 5 years thinking about experiments that I couldn't even do because I didn't have the equipment. And I spent so many times frustrated. And of course, you know, if I was to go after the publication, I wouldn't have done anything of the things I was interested in. I don't say they're important, but I was interested in. So there is too much of a turnover. You need to have this quick turnaround and feedback in order to progress in your career on a time span that is too short for science.
Yeah. No, that
This
is
the problem.
that is, Marcello, a very astute point that you made. I was going to ask you this question on this one. Do you see a difference? So on this whole short-term thinking, I need results, I need it now, and you need to publish because we have to maintain some metrics. Is that a US thing, or and you guys are more lucky in Europe in terms of giving people their freedom to do their stuff? Or is Europe pretty much similar to, and maybe it is different countries and that kind of a thing, but what do you think if you draw a contrast between US and—
I think, yeah, so I have a good, long experience with the US. So these 5 years, I've learned that, yes, it's, well, it's a US thing, but it's also a UK thing. And it could be also a thing for other European countries. I think it's more variable on a country-wise based. It's not an Italian thing in a dysfunctional way. Italy is dysfunctional on the opposite side. Like, you know, nobody really seriously, I mean, there are now processes for evaluating you, but, you know, it will take time before the US, UK way is incorporated here. For example, if I publish in Nature tomorrow, I'd be very happy. It will never happen again. But, you know, let's say I do it. Nothing would change in terms of, you know, my research opportunities, money, funding, and salary. Zero. Okay. Locally in Italy. This is good and bad. For me, it's good because I'm a and my team of beautiful, fantastic people, we work because we like it, because we are passionate. We don't need, but at the same time, we are free. If we screw up and for a couple of years, we don't publish the paper, it doesn't really matter. We can do things well, and we can do it in a way that is thoughtful. And when we come up with a paper, it's normally something that we've been reviewing internally and killing so many times. Sometimes our papers are very, I mean, we collect the data now and we publish in 5 years because we are not very well organized, but also because we are so, you know, because we take the luxury of thinking about it and also enjoying it. So I don't think, I'm not saying that this is the good way to go. I don't say that Italy, I would never say Italy is better than US, but for me, I moved here because of this freedom, you know, and there are many downsides, of course. You need to find money outside of Italy, and you have either European grants or you don't survive. But that's another story.
And then I think then, Marcello, on that point, I think it's a good point to finish our conversation on. For the audience that is listening, if somebody wants to partner with you, somebody wants to donate or invest in your different endeavors, what is your message to the universe about what kind of people should reach out to you for any collaboration or just giving you funds for research or investing in your endeavors? So any guidance for that community?
Thank you. So we welcome all kind of students, first of all. And I think that, you know, this chat was, I mean, I spoke to you in a very, I didn't even know we were recording at the beginning. Yeah. So yeah. To me, that was really a chat. So I think
it is, that's what it is. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you understand what kind of, you know, the spirit here.
Yeah.
And please come forward if you're interested in this kind of research. And in the, you know, also if you sort of resonate with this spirit that we have. So we don't promise high impact publication necessarily. You can be lucky, but I think it's an interesting, and it's teamwork, fantastic teamwork, multidisciplinary and engaging, from the patient to the theory, back to simulation, and then, you know, so I think it's interesting. In terms of investors, of course, you know, I could say many things. I mean, we worked on patients. We tried to, you know, assist the diagnosis of patients, do best we can. I think it might be interesting for investors to know that this technique is there. It works very well, and definitely it needs investors in terms of people who are interested or think that this is an interesting thing in perspective, and they want to contribute to the development of this machine. So here, I'm not the first, you know, I'm not the, what will happen for sure, that will be, there will be an effort to make this happen together with next team, with companies, and something will happen. So whoever is interested in, you know, following the development and opportunity for contributing to this, well, feel free to get in touch with me at any time, because it's happening now. So there is this effort, especially in the US, with Christoph Koch, Giulio Tononi, Harvard, the Massachusetts General Hospital, and in making this something that is, you know, a tool. So I don't know how this will happen. I know it's happening right now. So whoever wants to get in touch, I can
that'd be great. Marcello, sir, thank you for being so generous with your time. And you're so right. You know, my reach out is all just very informal, very conversational, just like this. Certainly you spoke from your heart, and that came across loud and clear. And I look forward to our continued conversations down the road as well. But thank you for your time.